Chapter 3: Treaties and Land Claims. Royal Proclamation of 1763. This is a chronological walk through treaties in Canada. There is a phrase, "We are all treaty people." This chapter will explain what that means. Let's start with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This proclamation was created to consolidate British holdings in US and Canada after defeating the French in the 7 Years' War. It formed the basis of land claims for Indigenous people in Canada. Listen to Senator Murray Sinclair talk about its importance.
We need to understand that the Royal Proclamation was issued after the war between the French and the English, and after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and after a whole bunch of very important historical incidents that occurred in which the power and the right of the Indian nations of North America played a very significant role, and in fact were highly sought after by those who were involved in that conflict at the time. And the role of the Aboriginal people at that time in resolving that conflict, or assisting in the resolution of that conflict, and in how that conflict all ended, was known far and wide by all of those who were in charge. And the Royal Proclamation was a recognition that Aboriginal people, Indian nations, First Nations as we now call them, were not to be trifled with, that they were to be respected, and that their rights to their territory and their right to take care of themselves within their own territory was not to be interfered with.
Unfortunately, Indigenous people's rights were interfered with, even with the signing of treaties. What are treaties? Treaties are formal agreements between two or more parties. They are international in scope, nation to nation. They were agreements between the Crown and First Nations. They contain obligations and expectations, both implicit and explicit. They recognize First Nation rights, including the right to hunt, fish, and trap, plus rights to annuities, education, and health care. They provide the Crown with the means to open up territories for settlement and development. According to the BC government, a treaty is a negotiated agreement that clearly spells out the rights, responsibilities, and relationships of First Nations and the federal and provincial governments. Peace and friendship treaties. Peace and friendship treaties were designed to support peace and friendship and allow for settlement. They were implemented in the East Coast region and were between the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and the British Crown. These treaties were not about land or surrendering land. Pre-Confederation treaties. In general, pre-Confederation treaties were hastily put together or were only oral promises. The Treaty of Niagara simply reiterated what was in the Royal Proclamation to respect Indigenous sovereignty. Some nations were convinced to sign their land away on blank documents. Douglas Treaties. The Douglas Treaties concerned the purchase of more than 600 square kilometers of land on Vancouver Island in return for gifts and rights to hunt and fish. 14 First Nations were involved. But Douglas never used the word treaty, and Indigenous signatories did not understand the concept of land ownership and did not have the authority to sign on behalf of all people occupying certain land. It begs the question, is that really a treaty? Great Lakes Treaties. The Great Lakes Treaties concerned a huge territory. The Great Lakes Treaties concerned a huge territory on the north shores of Lake Superior and Lake Huron. Negotiations started because mining prospectors and surveyors were making claims in the territory. First Nations complained to government, so treaty negotiations began. The result was the surrender of vast tracts of land, with people placed on reserves. Hunting and fishing rights were retained. There was a different understanding of what surrender meant to the parties involved. Numbered treaties. There are 11 numbered or post-Confederation treaties dealing with a huge landmass, much of it once called Rupert's Land. The intent was to enable settlement, agriculture, industry, and railroads. These treaties were signed between 1871 and 1921. Here are a few examples. Treaty 1. Provision for education not honored. The First Nations in Treaty 1 asked that a school be built on every reserve. Instead, the government followed the American model of regional or residential schools. These were more like training centers, less like educational facilities. Treaty 6, Poundmaker. The Cree leader involved resisted this treaty but was finally forced to accept. This treaty is the only one that provides for a medicine chest, or health care for all. Historical treaties. All of the treaties we have discussed so far are known as historical treaties. Note the areas on the map that are covered by a historical treaty. Modern treaties. Much of the land not governed by any historical treaties are subject to what are called modern treaties, or comprehensive land claim settlements. Since 1973, 22 such agreements have been signed. The first were the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975. The creation of Nunavut in 1999 is the largest land claim in Canada. New agreements and ongoing negotiations for much of BC are underway. Métis and treaties. The Métis have always been a special case when it comes to treaties. While the Crown was negotiating treaties, they realized that they had to figure out how to deal with the Métis or the half-breeds who occupied land, particularly in the prairies. While there were no formal treaties between Métis and the Crown, there were a number of half-breeds in northwestern Ontario who were added to Treaty 3. Instead of treaties, the Crown dealt with Métis using something called scrip, which was done on an individual basis rather than a community basis. Starting in the 1870s, scrip commissioners from the Northwest Half-Breed Commission traveled through much of the prairies and gathered Métis together to fill out application forms for their entitlements. This continued until the 1930s. If someone accepted scrip, it meant they extinguished their Aboriginal title and were given a certificate, which could be redeemed for either land or money. If they met the criteria, they were often given their certificate immediately. The entire process was bureaucratic and discouraged many Métis from participating. It was also not clear that by accepting scrip, they were giving up their land rights. Many were illiterate, and the term extinguishment of Aboriginal title does not appear anywhere in the application. Then, anyone with a certificate had to find available land by visiting an often faraway Dominion Lands office, then get a patent to that land that was often far away from where they might be currently living, wait for approval, and then possess that piece of land. This is not at all how Métis families and communities operated, and while some did try to follow the process, most did not. There was a lot of government indifference. Many illiterate Métis did not understand how the convoluted scrip process worked, and there were many unscrupulous speculators who swindled Métis out of their scrip. Self-government. When a First Nation, Inuit, or Métis community negotiates to take over former government responsibilities, for example in policing, education, or health. Another term often used regarding treaties and land claims is self-government. Canada has completed 18 comprehensive self-government agreements involving 32 communities. These include 16 self-government agreements completed in conjunction with comprehensive land claims in Newfoundland and Labrador, British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, as well as 2 standalone self-government agreements with the Sechelt and Westbank First Nations in BC. There is also a sectoral self-government agreement on education jurisdiction in Nova Scotia. Land claims. Land claims can take 2 forms. 1. Comprehensive land claims, or modern treaties. These are based on recognition that there are continuing Aboriginal rights to land and national resources in areas never surrendered or ceded. 2. Specific claims. These are those grievances brought against the government regarding existing historical treaties.